The day everything changed. The morning began with a steady drizzle that had washed the city clean during the night, leaving behind streets that smelled faintly of wet pavement, dust, and forgotten dreams. For Gabrielle Brooks, the sound of dripping water outside her small rented room was not a comfort, but a reminder that the world outside always moved faster than she could catch up with. She sat on the edge of a creaky iron bed, gently rocking her 11-month-old daughter Helena, whose dark curls framed a face that still held the softness of innocence. Helena's eyes were bright, curious, and always searching, as though she could already sense the struggles that surrounded her mother. Gabrielle pinned a salvaged red ribbon into her daughter's hair, a ribbon that once belonged to a dress she had long outgrown, but one that now seemed like a crown. It wasn't much, but it made Helena's little face glow with a kind of light that Gabrielle could only describe as hope. That day was already different, though Gabrielle didn't yet know it. The small community daycare she depended on had closed unexpectedly because there were not enough staff to run it. Her neighbors, though kind in words, were each caught in their own endless battles of work and survival. She had no one to call, no friend or relative who could step in, no safety net to keep her afloat. And so, when she looked at her baby girl, she whispered a trembling apology. "I'm sorry, Helena, but you have to come with me today." She packed a warm bottle, wrapped Helena in the cleanest blanket she owned, and prayed quietly that the day would not end with both of them out on the street. The bus ride was long and heavy with silence. Gabrielle sat near the fogged window, staring at the contrast of two worlds divided by a single city. On one side were tired apartment buildings with peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and corner shops that only accepted cash. Shoes left outside the doors were soaked from the rain, reminders of lives that could not afford to pause. On the other side, she caught glimpses of wide manicured lawns behind tall gates, glass towers shining like polished diamonds, and mansions, with walls that seemed designed to keep both noise and people away. Each stop brought her closer to the Santoro mansion, where she worked as a maid, her job hanging by a thread so thin that even a single mistake could snap it forever. By the time she arrived at the iron gates of the estate, Gabrielle's heart was pounding. She carried Helena in one arm, her cleaning supplies in the other, and tried to steady her breath. The mansion itself was enormous, built with glass, marble, and stone in a way that made it look more like a museum than a home. Security guards, in dark suits, patrolled silently, moving like shadows across the estate grounds. The air smelled of trimmed grass and polished floors, nothing like the fried food and gasoline that clung to the streets she had just left behind. She entered through the back kitchen door, her usual route, hoping to avoid drawing attention. Inside, she placed Helena carefully on a small rug in the corner, handing her a pot lid and a wooden spoon to keep her occupied. The sharp, cold smell of floor cleaner filled the air as Gabrielle gripped her mop and bucket. She had barely started scrubbing when her heart began to thump louder. What if someone saw the baby? What if her boss found out? She had heard stories about Mr. Val Santoro, the millionaire who owned this mansion. People described him as cold, detached, and unapproachable since the death of his wife years earlier. His presence carried weight, and his decisions often left no room for mercy. To be caught with her baby here could mean instant dismissal. But as fate often chooses the most unlikely moments to change lives, that morning turned in a way Gabrielle could never have predicted. At the far end of the mansion, Val Santoro canceled his morning meetings, telling his assistant he needed time to check some numbers. In truth, he was tired of the noise, the shallow conversations, and the endless reminders of success that felt empty without someone to share it with. He had built walls of silence around himself, preferring to retreat into the cold quiet of his own home. Yet as he walked through the living room lined with abstract paintings and pristine white leather chairs, something stopped him in his tracks. A sound, light and unfamiliar, broke the silence. A child's laugh. Val froze at the doorway, his hand tightening on the edge of the frame. On the polished marble floor, he saw a tiny girl in a red dress, her curls bouncing as she clapped her chubby hands and banged the pot lid with joy. The color of the dress blazed against the otherwise sterile tones of the mansion, as if someone had spilled life itself across the room. Gabrielle, caught mid-motion with her mop, turned pale when she saw him. Her mind raced with fear. She expected anger, scolding, maybe even immediate dismissal. But what happened next was nothing like the stories she had heard. Val set aside his coat, walked slowly into the room, and lowered himself onto one knee beside the child. He picked up a wooden block from the floor, wiggled it gently in front of Helena. "Hey, princess," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth even he hadn't expected from himself. "May I play too?" Helena squealed, reaching toward him with a toothless grin, her laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged room like music that had been missing for years. Gabrielle stood frozen, her mop forgotten, as she watched the most powerful man she knew kneel before her daughter, a gesture that inverted every scale of power she had ever known. For the first time in her life inside this mansion, Gabrielle felt as though she wasn't just an invisible worker cleaning someone else's world. She was seen. Val played with Helena, handing her his family's pocket watch, an heirloom that had always symbolized his lineage and authority. In Helena's tiny hands, it was no longer a symbol of wealth or power, but simply a toy, something safe and ordinary. Gabrielle turned away, wiping her eyes quickly, afraid someone might see her tears. Her chest ached with a strange mix of fear, gratitude, and disbelief. "What's her name?" Val asked, his eyes never leaving Helena. "Helena," Gabrielle answered, her voice trembling. Val repeated it slowly, as though savoring the syllables. "Helena, a strong name." Then he looked up at Gabrielle, his eyes warmer than she had ever seen them. "You were wrong to bring her here without telling me," he said honestly. "But if this laughter has returned to my house because of that mistake, then it is the most beautiful mistake I have ever seen." Those words shifted something deeper than Gabrielle could describe. The house, once silent and cold, seemed to breathe again. The walls that had been witnesses only to grief now heard the sound of joy. And in that moment, the seeds of a change began to take root, one that would soon alter the lives of Gabrielle, her daughter, and Val himself. The fracture of silence, the hue. Sound of Helena's laughter did not fade easily. It lingered in the marble halls like sunlight sneaking through heavy curtains, unwelcome to some, but impossible to stop. Val had not realized until that moment how starved his home had been for such a sound, how much the air itself had grown stale without the presence of a voice so pure, so uncalculated, so innocent. For years, since the death of his wife Elise, he had lived surrounded by immaculate furniture, guarded art pieces, and the silence of rooms so polished that they no longer felt alive. He had walked the corridors like a man carrying his own tombstone, always dressed in sharp suits, always followed by the weight of reputation, but never by warmth. Now, watching Helena's small fingers clutch his pocket watch with the seriousness of discovery, he realized how far away he had drifted from the simple truth of life, that joy was not built from marble and steel, but from laughter, touch, and shared moments. Gabrielle did not know whether to be relieved or terrified. She stood in the corner, her hands gripping the mop handle so tightly that her knuckles whitened, waiting for the spell to break, waiting for someone to rush in and remind them all of the rules. She had grown up knowing that people like her did not belong in houses like this, that a single slip could send her back into the darkness of unemployment and unpaid rent. Yet in front of her, the richest man she had ever met was on his knees, playing with her baby. It was a sight that unsettled her more than anger would have, for it hinted at something larger, something dangerous in its unfamiliarity. Val looked up at her again, his expression unreadable at first. "Go on with your work," he said gently. "I'll watch her for a few minutes." The words were light, casual, yet Gabrielle felt the weight of their meaning. A man like him had no business watching the child of a maid, yet he said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She hesitated, then bent to her task, her hands trembling as she scrubbed the already clean floors, her ears tuned to every sound Helena made. The shift in the house was immediate. Clara Mitchell, the head housekeeper, paused on the stairs when she heard Helena's laughter. Louise Carter, the chef, peeked through the kitchen door and nearly dropped her spoon when she saw Val seated cross-legged on the floor with a baby. Jim Walker, the gardener, passed by a window and stopped mid-step, his mouth curling into a slow smile at the strange and gentle sight. Whispers began to move through the mansion, subtle at first, like drafts slipping under doors. The boss, who had become a ghost of himself, was suddenly kneeling on the floor, letting a child pull at his tie. But not all hearts in that mansion softened at the sight. Bianca Hayes, Val's fiancée and a woman who had long guarded the Santoro image with an iron grip, was already on her way home. She was sharp, ambitious, and relentless in her pursuit of order. Where Val sought silence to bury grief, Bianca sought silence to control appearances. She had little patience for surprises, and even less tolerance for anything that threatened the spotless reputation she had worked to polish. For her, the house was not a home but a stage, each room another act in a performance for the world. A child banging a pot lid in the living room was not endearing. It was a scandal waiting to happen. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Gabrielle discovered something that would soon bind her fate with Val's in ways neither of them could have imagined. While reaching for a towel, her hand brushed against a tin box on the top shelf. Inside, she found a collection of worn notebooks covered in fabric, their edges frayed with time. When she opened the first one, she saw handwriting that was elegant yet warm. The cover bore a name that froze her breath. Elise. These were the recipes of Val's late wife, preserved like secret treasures in the kitchen. Gabrielle turned the pages slowly, her heart beating faster with every line she read. They were not just recipes. They were instructions on how to bring life back into a room, how to turn silence into conversation, how to soften grief with food. One line read, "Orange pound cake, cut while warm, and share immediately when the silence is heavy." Gabrielle stared at those words as though they were meant for this very day. On instinct, she gathered the ingredients: flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and the zest of a ripe orange. She measured carefully, her movements tender and precise, as if Elise herself were guiding her hands. The scent of citrus filled the kitchen, spreading warmth into corners that had been cold for years. The oven hummed softly, and as the cake began to rise, the air grew thick with the promise of comfort. When Val entered the kitchen some time later, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He stopped at the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something quieter, deeper. "I thought I dreamed of cinnamon," he said with a faint smile. "But it seems the house remembers how to live." Gabrielle looked up, startled, then quickly lowered her gaze. She placed 2 cups of coffee on the counter, her hand still shaking. They sat together at the kitchen island, an act that broke years of hierarchy in a single moment. Val opened Elise's notebook beside her, reading aloud lines that felt less like instructions and more like gentle commandments. Add cinnamon when life feels stiff. When silence grows heavy, cut warm and share. His voice grew softer with each sentence, and Gabrielle realized that he was not simply reading, he was remembering. For him, Elise was no longer only a ghost in the photographs that lined the mansion. She was here, in the handwriting, in the recipes, in the laughter of a baby who had brought him back into the kitchen. The cake emerged golden and fragrant. Gabrielle cut 2 thick slices, sprinkling them with powdered sugar before sliding one toward Val. He took a bite, closed his eyes, and for a moment his face softened so completely that Gabrielle almost didn't recognize him. When he opened his eyes again, there was a glimmer of gratitude there, not the kind that is spoken at boardroom tables, but the kind that anchors itself in the heart. "It's the same," he whispered, his voice rough. "No," Gabrielle said quietly. "There's something of yours in it." Val's gaze shifted toward Helena, who was sleeping peacefully in her blanket on the rug. "Maybe it's her," he said, his lips curving into something that almost resembled a smile. "Everything feels different through her." And just as the warmth of the cake and coffee seemed to settle into the house's bones, a chill entered through the doorway. Bianca Hayes stood there, her blazer sharp, her hair pinned into perfection, her perfume slicing through the air like a blade. Her eyes moved quickly from the coffee cups to the cake, from the open notebook to the sleeping child. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "What a scene," she said coldly, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is not a kitchen. This is a circus." The fragile warmth trembled, but Val did not rise. He set down his fork, met Bianca's gaze directly, and spoke words that would shape the battles to come. "This house is relearning how to feel, and if that means breaking a few rules, then so be it." Bianca's jaw tightened, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she crossed the kitchen like it belonged to her stage. "People will talk about this," she said, her voice a warning. "They will talk about you, about her, about what kind of household this has become." Val did not flinch. "Then let them talk," he replied. "Because I've decided where the respect in this house belongs. It belongs here, in laughter, in warmth, in care." Bianca's eyes narrowed. For her, this was not just rebellion. It was betrayal. She spun on her heel, her perfume trailing behind her, and left the kitchen with sharp footsteps that echoed, like a threat. The house held its breath. Gabrielle gathered Helena into her arms, holding her close, feeling the storm that had just entered their lives. Val looked at her, his voice gentler than before. "Keep cooking, keep caring. The rest, we'll defend." And with those words, the fracture between silence and warmth widened into a fault line, one that would soon shake the entire mansion. The storm at the gate. The days that followed Bianca's sudden appearance in the kitchen carried a strange tension, like the heavy air before a summer storm. The mansion itself seemed divided between two languages, the old language of order and image and the new language of laughter and warmth. Some of the staff leaned quietly toward Gabrielle, offering nods of encouragement or small smiles when Helena's giggles floated through the halls. Others whispered in corners, nervous about how long this could last before Bianca's sharp words turned into sharper actions. For Gabrielle, every step inside the mansion felt like walking a tightrope. She carried the joy of seeing her daughter safe and cherished in a place that had once been so cold, but she also carried the fear that at any moment, one wrong look, or one careless word could end everything. Val himself seemed changed. He still wore his tailored suits, still held meetings with powerful men and women in sleek offices, but there was a shift in his eyes, a gentleness that had not been there before. When he returned home, he no longer disappeared into his study with a glass of scotch. Instead, he lingered near the kitchen, watching Helena crawl across the rugs or asking Gabrielle about the recipes she had found in Elise's notebooks. For the first time in years, the mansion was not simply a shell for his grief. It was becoming a place where he could breathe again. And yet, beneath this fragile rebirth, a battle was quietly forming. Bianca was not a woman to let go of control easily. She began making calls, arranging dinners, and reminding Val of upcoming charity events, each one chosen carefully to remind him of the world that watched his every move. She dropped comments like stones, subtle at times, sharp at others. "A man of your status should not be seen in the kitchen with staff," she would say, or, "Imagine the headlines if the press ever saw you with a maid's child in your arms." For her, reputation was currency, and any hint of softness was a liability. Gabrielle, though humble and quiet, could feel Bianca's shadow pressing harder every day. She tried to keep Helena hidden in corners when Bianca was around, tried to finish her work quickly so that no one could accuse her of distraction. But Helena was a child, innocent and full of light, and sometimes her laughter carried farther than Gabrielle's caution could silence. One afternoon, Helena's giggle echoed down the hall just as Bianca was returning from a meeting. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing like a blade catching the sun. She entered the room where Val was sitting with Helena on his lap, reading aloud from a book in Elise's collection. "What is this?" Bianca asked, her voice cutting through the warmth like ice water poured on fire. "Is this how you plan to run your household now, like a daycare?" Val did not flinch. He turned the page slowly, letting Helena's small hand rest on the paper. "This house has been silent for too long," he said. "I'd rather it sound like this." Bianca's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're forgetting who you are," she hissed. "You're not a school teacher. You're not a father to every child that wanders in here. You are Val Santoro, a man whose name carries weight across this city, and every choice you make reflects on us." Gabrielle, standing frozen near the doorway, lowered her eyes, but inside her chest her heart beat like a drum. She had no words to offer, no defense she could safely give. She could only wait and pray that Val would not yield to the pressure. "I know who I am," Val said firmly, closing the book. "But I am also a man who lost everything once, and I will not choose silence again when I have been given another chance to hear laughter in these halls." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time Bianca faltered. She turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath, and left the room with the sharp click of her heels echoing behind her. The silence she left behind was not heavy. It was relieved, like the air after thunder has rolled past. The new beginning. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the Santoro mansion had ever known. The house, once defined by its cold perfection and the silence of untouchable wealth, began to breathe with new rhythms. Where once the staff moved, like shadows unseen and unheard, now they lingered in the kitchen to share a slice of bread or laugh at Helena's newest attempt to walk on unsteady legs. Where once Val sat alone in rooms too large for a single man, he now found himself drawn into conversations at the kitchen island, listening not to reports or numbers but to stories, memories, and the simple chatter of life. Outside, the world continued to watch. Reporters still tried to frame the story as a scandal, some even calling Gabrielle opportunistic, painting her as a maid who had found a way to climb into a life she did not deserve. But for every cruel article, there were letters, hundreds of them, sent to the estate. Letters from single mothers, from working fathers, from people who had felt invisible for too long. They wrote about the struggle of leaving children in unsafe daycares, of missing milestones because work demanded their presence elsewhere, of living lives where survival left little room for tenderness. They wrote to thank Val for showing the world a different image, not the cold perfection of power, but the simple act of a man kneeling on the floor to play with a child. Val read these letters in the evenings, his brow furrowed, his heart strangely moved. He had built his reputation on deals and dominance, on winning battles that most people would never even see. Yet these letters reminded him that true victories were often invisible, fought in the quiet struggles of ordinary people who never made headlines. Each story strengthened his resolve, deepened his belief that the changes he was making were not only right but necessary. Gabrielle noticed the difference too. She saw the way Val carried himself now, not with the heavy armor of grief but with a quieter strength. He still mourned Elise. Gabrielle knew that would never change, but he no longer let that mourning turn into silence. Instead, he allowed life to move through the mansion again. He invited the staff to join meals, asked Jim about the garden, complimented Louise on her soups. Small gestures, yet in a house that had been locked in sorrow for so long they were nothing short of revolutionary. For Gabrielle, the transformation was both a blessing and a weight. She had never wanted to stand at the center of attention. Her life had always been about working quietly, surviving each day, protecting her daughter. But now she could not ignore the way the world spoke her name, even when they twisted it. She often lay awake at night, Helena sleeping peacefully beside her, wondering if she had made a mistake bringing her child into this house. Yet when she remembered Helena's laughter echoing against marble walls or Val's gentle defense of her presence, she knew there was no mistake. Sometimes survival leads you to the very place you were meant to change. The turning point came one afternoon when Val called a press conference, something he rarely did unless it involved major business decisions. The media expected him to announce a new acquisition or respond to the controversy directly. Instead, he stood on a modest stage in front of his company's headquarters, dressed simply, no flashy backdrops behind him. Cameras flashed as he began to speak. "For many years I believed success was measured only in numbers," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unusual softness. I believed that strength meant silence, that grief meant shutting out the world. But I was wrong. Strength is not silence. Strength is allowing life to return when you least expect it. It is choosing to care when it would be easier not to. It is remembering that behind every number, behind every deal, there are people. People with children, with families, with lives that deserve dignity. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. That is why, starting today, Santoro Holdings will provide on-site childcare for all employees. No parent should have to choose between keeping their job and caring for their child. No child should be left in unsafe hands because their parent had no other choice. We will build workplaces where family is not a weakness, but a strength. Phew. Room fell silent before erupting in questions. Some called it impractical, others visionary, but the headlines the next day shifted dramatically. No longer was Val Santoro mocked as a man distracted by sentiment. Instead, he was praised as a leader who dared to change the rules. Back at the mansion, Gabrielle watched the press conference on a small screen in the laundry room, tears slipping down her cheeks. She held Helena close, whispering softly, "He did this because of you, my love, because of your laughter." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps her life, humble as it was, had left an imprint on the world far larger than she had ever dreamed. That evening, the kitchen filled with the smell of Elise's orange pound cake once more. The staff gathered together. Each offered a slice, each sharing in the warmth of something greater than food. Val sat at the island with Helena on his knee, her little hands reaching eagerly for crumbs of cake. Gabrielle stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a heart full of gratitude. She had started this journey with fear, carrying her baby into a house that felt like a fortress. Now that fortress had become a home, not perfect, not free of challenges, but alive again. As the night settled, Clara leaned against the doorway, smiling quietly. "This house was asleep for too long," she said softly. "Now it feels awake." Gabrielle nodded, her eyes fixed on Helena's tiny hands, her mind replaying the long road that had brought them here. She knew the world outside would continue to judge, would continue to whisper, but inside these walls something unshakable had been born. Val lifted his glass of water, not as a toast to wealth or success, but to the people around him. "To family," he said simply. Gabrielle met his eyes across the table, her heart steady. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a maid. She felt like someone who mattered, someone who had brought light back into a place where it had been lost. And as Helena laughed, clapping her tiny hands against the table, the sound rose through the mansion like music, sealing the promise that, no matter what storms came from outside, this house would never again return to silence.